then of course there's Trump's threats, his threats against Russia, very, very sort of empty threats in my opinion, where he says he's going to impose all sorts of sanctions on Russia. But we've already gone down that road. We've imposed all sorts of sanctions on Russia, and that hasn't changed Putin's behavior.
Hi, I'm Maddie, Hale, and welcome to the Trump Report. Today we've had Sir Bill Browder on the show. He's spoken to us about this meeting between Steve Witkoff and Vladimir Putin last week, talked to us through the fact that Putin made him wait hours in the meeting room. We've got another meeting, a phone call between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump this week. So he spoke to us about whether a ceasefire will actually happen, what Putin actually wants. So all that today, as well as ongoing discussions with the coalition of the willing, whether Europe and the UK might send troops to Ukraine, what they need to do, whether sanctions have been working. So all that today on the Trump Report. You can watch us every day, Monday through Friday on Times Radio's YouTube. So Bill Browder, thank you for joining the Trump Report today. We're going to kick off with recent comments from Steve Witkoff, Trump's Middle Eastern envoy. He met with Vladimir Putin last week for a 4-hour meeting. He said it was positive, but we haven't exactly had Vladimir Putin sign on to this 30-day ceasefire. Instead, he basically said there are conditions that he's put in place. What was your response to this, I guess, lack of outcome?
Well, first, we should look at the actual sort of theatrics of the meeting. So after Ukraine agreed to a 30-day ceasefire, and after the world then sort of jumped to the side of Ukraine and said, the ball is now in Putin's court, Trump sent his emissary, Steve Witkoff, to Moscow for an immediate talk with Putin. And Putin had him wait the entire day, I think more than 8 hours, in the sort of waiting room. I mean, it was a sign of massive disrespect. And then they had their meeting. I don't know what was discussed, but what I can tell you is that what wasn't discussed was a ceasefire. There was no ceasefire agreed, as it was with Ukraine. And what Putin said was that he had all sorts of, he kind of liked the idea of a ceasefire in principle, but he had all sorts of conditions and issues and so on and so forth. In my opinion, Putin has never had any interest in stopping this war. He doesn't have an interest in a ceasefire. And he's just looking for a way to get out of this sort of uncomfortable situation he's in. On one hand, he doesn't want to stop the war, because if he stops the war, then people in Russia have to start asking him a lot of tough questions about why he got into the war in the first place. But at the same time, if he doesn't stop the war, then he enrages Donald Trump. And so he's got to figure out an elegant way out of this. And my sense is that what he's going to try to do is he's going to try to put all sorts of conditions back on Ukraine. And then President Trump is going to go to Ukraine and demand that they accept these conditions, which will be unacceptable conditions. And then Ukraine won't accept them. And then Trump can blame the breakdown in these talks on Ukraine as opposed to Russia. And, the attitude, all the body language signals that that's the way this is going to go. And I suspect that is the way it's going to go.
It's another roundabout kind of situation. We're just back to square one, if that is the case, Bill. But if that does happen and Putin puts certain requirements in place in this deal that Ukraine would obviously not commit to, would Donald Trump, do you think, turn around and lash out at Zelensky again, even if they're conditions that no leader of any sovereign country would accept?
Well, I mean, based on the meeting in the Oval Office where Trump started shouting at Zelensky, I think that's the highest likelihood outcome. I think that the the Americans can again cut off military aid for Ukraine, again cut off intelligence sharing, perhaps even put pressure on Europe in certain ways to not support Ukraine. I mean, everything is possible, and the way that Trump has sort of turned the tables on previous, 80-year foreign policy would suggest that's what he's going to do.
And it is, I don't want to say entertaining, Bill, but you mentioned before that Putin kept Steve Witkoff waiting. It was funny because from the media perspective, we're waiting and waiting for an update. Steve, we know that there were signs that a US military flight had arrived, and then there was no word on if they'd met. No one even confirmed if they'd met for hours. So it was kind of a bizarre situation. But we do know now that after that meeting, Donald Trump says that he will have a phone call with Vladimir Putin on Tuesday to discuss this ceasefire. Steve Witkoff backed that up and said that he expects there will be a ceasefire within the next few weeks after this phone call. But how confident are you that that will even happen?
Well, I'm not confident that it's going to happen. I think that, remember, Trump was the same person who predicted that he would end the war in 24 hours. And so if they're making predictions that it's going to be done in several weeks, I don't see any reason why those predictions should be any more credible. I mean, we have to step back and look at what's really going on. Putin has not in any way retreated from his most maximalist demands of Ukraine. In fact, he's even increased those demands and these are demands that started at the beginning of the war and have not in any way varied. He wants Ukraine to demilitarize, in other words, to put down their arms, to have an election where he can somehow get rid of Zelensky. He wants Ukraine to give up not just where the Russians' troops have gotten to, but all of the self-declared Russian regions of Ukraine, where Russia basically declared the 4 regions of Ukraine to be theirs, even though they don't occupy them. That's what Putin wants. And he doesn't want any peacekeepers from any foreign countries, certainly not any NATO countries on Ukrainian soil. And so all these things add up to an unacceptable deal. And so, and I don't see how Putin backs down from those demands. He never has shown any indication that he would do so. And then of course, there's Trump's threats. His threats against Russia, very, very sort of empty threats, in my opinion, where he says he's going to impose all sorts of sanctions on Russia. But we've already gone down that road. We've imposed all sorts of sanctions on Russia, and that hasn't changed Putin's behavior. And so it's hard for me to imagine that there are any more sanctions that could change his behavior other than one, which is the embargoing of Russian oil. But that's something that I don't think the United States or anyone else has the appetite to do, because doing that would then increase the price of oil by 100% perhaps. And in a world that's still tiptoeing around inflation, I don't think that that's an acceptable, I don't think that the governments would see that as an acceptable price to pay. So it's kind of hard for me to see how Trump has any leverage to force Putin to do something, if that would even be his intention. And it's hard for me to see how Putin has any incentive whatsoever to reduce his maximalist demands, which he has had since the very beginning.
It would be not tough for Trump, but you can imagine, Bill, that it's anything to do with oil, anything that would upset the US market, the US economy, is obviously something that he's going to avoid doing. I mean, during the Biden administration's 4 years, the price of oil, the economy, it went through the ringer because of the Russia-Ukraine war. And even though the Trump administration will strongly place any blame on the Biden administration and had nothing to do with them, so I do think he'll avoid that, especially because of the market tank last week. But you mentioned this 24-hour window. Donald Trump, he campaigned 24 hours. It will take Donald Trump, the hero, to end this war in Ukraine. He was asked about it the other day, actually, and he says he wasn't serious about that. Just another one of his walkback comments. But I wonder, Bill, do you think that Donald Trump underestimated Putin in regards to how he would play ball?
Well, I don't think that he ever had any expectation that Putin would play ball. I think he underestimated Zelensky. So he thought that he could somehow force Zelensky into a total surrender. He thought that the Ukrainians had no agency. He thought the Europeans had no agency. He thought that basically he could dictate terms to Europe and to Ukraine, and that he could do a favor for Putin and that all would be resolved. And what he's discovered is that the Ukrainians are not ready to sacrifice themselves to Russia for whatever Donald Trump's vision of the end of this war. And if they're not ready to sacrifice themselves, he gets angry, and his anger was expressed very clearly in the Oval Office. And the one thing that's good about Trump is that he's not a poker player. I mean, he wears his heart on his sleeve. We know exactly that there are no tells. We don't need a tell. It's all there, right out in the open for everyone to see. He's made it clear. He has disdain for Ukraine. He doesn't think of it as a real country. He doesn't think that even Putin started the war, and he has admiration for Vladimir Putin. I mean, there's no there's no beating around the bush. There's no sort of hidden agenda here. This is what he is, what he does and says. That's his position, and we should understand that that's his position, and we should then adapt ourselves to how do we work in a world where that is his position, and the way we do is that for the United Kingdom and for the rest of Europe and for Australia and for Canada and all the other countries that are still on Ukraine's side to come up with a plan for how Ukraine continues to protect themselves from an invasion that Putin could end at any moment he wanted to, with just one decision of his, which is to stop the invasion. And what does that mean in terms of supporting Ukraine? It means we have to give them more money to pay for weapons. And what does that mean? Where does that money come from? Well, the obvious answer is it comes from the $300 billion of Russian reserves, which are frozen in the West. It's a pretty straightforward policy situation where the continued allies of Ukraine need to step up and do what's necessary. And at that point, Trump can wash his hands of Ukraine and say that the Ukrainians were being unreasonable. The Europeans can step in to the void. The Russian money can be used, and Ukraine can continue to defend themselves. And then at a point of their choosing, they can negotiate, not being pressured to surrender from the outside, but to come up with a military advantage that Putin will then have to negotiate. But Putin has no incentive to negotiate right now.
What I wonder is, why is Europe, yes, you've spoken about how the European economy is obviously a lot more than the Russian economy, and how Europe and the UK and fellow NATO countries have a lot in their tank. They can offer a lot. So right now, we're 2 months into the administration, the US administration. We still don't have a negotiation. We still don't have an outcome. We still don't have concessions from Russia. We still have Ukraine saying that they won't give up certain things, which is understandable. So why won't Europe go at this alone? Why won't Europe, UK, Australia, fellow NATO countries be like, look, the United States didn't include us in these early negotiations, so why can't we just step up? Like, what are they waiting for?
Well, in a certain way, they have. Emmanuel Macron said that it's his intention, if there is a ceasefire, to put French soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. And it's not Putin is not in a place where he can make demands of what France does or doesn't do. We have the German chancellor, the new incoming German chancellor, Friedrich Merz, talking about dramatically increasing defense spending up to 800 billion euros or some enormous number like that. You have Keir Starmer, who assembled a coalition of the willing of countries that are ready to put soldiers on the ground in Ukraine to defend a ceasefire. And there's now an operational meeting of generals taking place in the UK about that. I mean, you have a French company, Eutelsat, which is now gearing up to replace Starlink with communications on the front line. But the reason why Europe still and Ukraine still desperate for America, first of all, America has historically supplied 40% of all military aid. But more importantly than that, the one thing that's irreplaceable is the intelligence that America supplies. America has an enormous amount of spy satellites which can detect troop movements, missiles being fired, all sorts of other stuff, which gives the Ukrainians an ability to defend themselves. And if the United States withdraws that intelligence, Ukraine is effectively flying blind. And that's a very serious issue. And to the extent that the U.S. can be kept on side, it's dramatically better than Ukraine basically having to fight with one hand tied behind their back and with all sorts of blind spots and so on and so forth. And so, in an ideal world, America and Europe continue to support Ukraine, but we're not in an ideal world. We're in a world where, for reasons that so far nobody understands, Trump has decided to throw Ukraine under the bus, and so how this resolves itself, it may not be pretty, but Ukraine is not going to surrender, even if Donald Trump wants him to.
You are right, and we do have this coalition of the willing meeting tomorrow, I think it is. So it will be interesting to see if boots on the ground is the answer and whether countries are willing to start sending them, Bill. But I guess on that note, we know that Russia's economy is dwindling. We know that that is a big kind of saving grace in terms of how long this war could actually go on for. Because Russia just doesn't have much money, plain and simple. Putin can't fund a war forever. So why wouldn't the strategy be, because we've obviously noticed that this conversation between Putin and Trump isn't going that well. We don't think that we'll probably get an answer out of that. We don't think that he'll come to the table with anything reasonable. So why would the strategy not be for Europe, the UK, the United States and fellow NATO countries to basically bombard Russia with sanctions, tariffs, and not only that, but apply more of them to Iran, who's been supplying Russia with these short-range missiles, basically completely tank their economy?
Well, again, we've tried doing that for a long time, and there's so many loopholes in terms of these sanctions. When I say loopholes, there are countries, China, India, the global south, that continue to do business with Russia. Russia continues to sell oil. Oil continues to generate hard currency, which Russia uses to fund its war economy. And so that hasn't been a strategy that's worked so far. Now, that combined with doubling down or tripling down on weapons supplies to the Ukrainians probably would work over some period of time. But the problem is that Putin has no constituents. He can do whatever he wants for as long as he wants, and he can inflict as much pain on Russia as he wants, and there's no consequence. He'll still be the president of Russia afterwards. Everybody here in this side of the world, we live in democracies, where if we experience 1/100th of the pain that Putin experiences, people all throw up their hands in the air and say, "Oh my God, this is too much sacrifice. What are we doing this for? Why is this happening? We've got to stop it. This war has gone on for too long. It's time to call an end to it." That's how Putin is playing it, and he's very fortunate that he doesn't have any constituents. I mean, according to Ukrainian numbers, I was just looking at them this morning. Russia has lost 892,000 soldiers. 892,000 soldiers. The amount of equipment that's been destroyed is unimaginable. The economy, of course, it's not doing. It's not. The economy hasn't collapsed, but it's not doing well at all. And so all of this stuff, in any normal situation, Putin would have been gone, 2 weeks into the war. But because he doesn't have constituents that could get rid of him, there's no democracy there, because there's no law there. There's no parliamentarians that could throw him out. There's no media that could humiliate him. He can carry on for a very long time. And so the only way that we can stop this war is by giving Ukraine what they need to effectively win the war. And we could give them what they need to win this war. And they've been begging for it for a long time. And the reason that we haven't, and this is Biden's fault, not Trump's fault, is that he was so scared of Putin escalating that he only wanted to give Ukrainians enough weapons so that they didn't lose, but not enough weapons so that they won.
I actually spoke to a former military advisor to the Ukrainian Defense Force the other week, and I asked her about that. Joe Biden finally greenlighting Ukraine to be able to use those long-range missiles into Russia, and she said that it was an absolute game changer. So they felt like they were actually on the right foot in terms of how far the Ukraine military was advancing. But then, of course, revoking military aid and intelligence, especially the intelligence, was kind of felt pretty soon, and that was backed up by a pretty insane quote from a US medic in Ukraine who said that they couldn't see drones coming through in broad daylight, and how scary would that be to be listening to your US president on the radio while she's healing her friends, telling them that they're switching sides to support Russia. But just a final question, Bill, because I thought this was interesting. I spoke to a journalist, a foreign policy and security expert, Jimmy Rushton. You might know him. He's based in Kyiv. And he actually backed up that thought, that said the only actual threat that Donald Trump could use on Putin that would work would be to threaten him with more military aid, more money, more intelligence, more backing to Ukraine. Is that what you think?
Well, I think that that's the key variable that could put Putin on his knees. Basically, the longer the range the missiles, the more effective the Ukrainians can be at destroying Russian military infrastructure further into Russia, the more difficult it is for Putin to do what he's trying to do. And Putin, they're celebrating right now all this stuff in Moscow. I mean, they couldn't believe how lucky they've been that things have turned around, not because of their own success, but just because of the change in geopolitics. All of a sudden, the Americans who were their biggest adversary are now effectively on their side, and it's kind of unimaginable for me and unimaginable for them. It's such a gift for them.
I mean, I don't think anyone could have predicted this, but as so many expert guests, and I think yourself, have said on the Trump report, that the only saving grace for this is that Trump is so unpredictable that we don't know when he's going to swing back onto the side of Ukraine. So Bill Browder, thank you so much for your time today. We've got the Coalition of the Willing meeting this week. We've got Trump's discussion with Vladimir Putin this week. So there's so much going on in terms of the Russia-Ukraine, and we hope to get a bit more clarity soon. So thank you for joining the Trump Report.
Thank you.